I think let's then kick off. I'm sure we'll get more rolling in as time goes on. Sometimes it's tricky to join in or see more are joining, but welcome to all those that are joining this live webinar with our partner, AWS. It's Bundu here. I'm your host today from Tech Tribe Community. And really, this is a place where we want to be engaging with the presenters that we have today, which I'm very excited to get into what they'll be talking about, which is building your MVP and prototyping basically in 2 days. So getting to the customers as quickly as possible. I won't say much about that, except just to remind you guys that please do get into the chats there if you have questions or points that you want to share as we're going through the session today. It is meant to be an interactive one, and one that is also discussion based, which we'll try and make some time for towards the end. But without further ado, over then to you, Henry, and Kobus, and to lead us through this is Henry, the presenter, and Kobus today as well. Thanks.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for your time. I'm Henry Zitzman. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm based in Cape Town. I work with startup programs across Africa. We've done a session previously, which is recorded, which is basically welcome to day one. Buntu will share that with you. It is basically summarizing which programs are available for you to build on. As well as to scale with AWS. In other words, in a way to how to partner with AWS to make a success out of your business of being a startup. So today what I wanted to do was do a presentation with Kobus, my colleague, around building an MVP. And he will take us through the logic about MVP. He will show us the tools that's available for you to build on AWS and MVP. The idea being that you can go to market very quickly. And I really hope that you can also have a look. There's a Slido that I've put into the chat window for you. That Slido will be open for basically 3 days. So if you come up with questions, even in the session or during the session, just pop a question in there. You can rate every question if you see it's very important for yourself. And then what you can also do is we'll basically follow up after that with answers to your questions. So Kobus, welcome.
Awesome. So just quickly before we jump into the presentation itself, let me just start off by giving you a little bit of context about why I'm here and what my history is. And the first thing is, yes, I apologize. I am officially in marketing. I'm no longer a developer, but I still do a lot of developing and actually building technical solutions. So my history is software developer coming up on, I think, 15 years now, 16. It's at the point where it's a bit fuzzy, as in full time. And AWS customer for 8 years before I actually joined the team last year, January, as a developer advocate. So my role is actually helping people understand how to use AWS from the technical side, showing them with talks and demos and helping them understand it. In terms of specific history, start off developing apps in Java, then switched over to C# and Windows, then went back to Java and Linux, then went back to C# and Windows. And along the way, started automating everything and helping people onboard onto the cloud. Also did a couple of detours doing some mobile app development and also even a game. I can brag, the game is in Steam, but I don't want to mention it because it's not a great game. But I have worked with startups, notably some ones that you might recognize locally, HealthQ Technologies or LifeQ, depending on which side of the brand you are aware of in Stellenbosch. Also Project Finance, which is more a US one, which is a cross-border study loan service. And there's another one, which I can guarantee you almost 70-80% of you will have the app on your phone, but unfortunately, due to NDA reasons, I cannot mention it. But you'll likely have it. So I've built a couple of things. But speaking of building, let me quickly get my slides up and running. So where is my screen sharing button? Here we go. Green one. We want to share screen 2. And the first thing you'll notice here while I get this ready is that the first slide is duplicated, and that's on purpose because if you ever do a presentation and you have a clicker and you need to know if said clicker is working, you duplicate the slide, because now what I'm actually doing is I've now clicked to the second slide and you don't know about it, but I can confirm that my hardware is working. So tools for building your MVP on AWS. This talk focuses not just on the, hey, here's a couple of service solutions, put these things together and voila, you've got a service. This is more about the reasoning of how you should think about the whole process in terms of you've got developers they're building, how do you figure out what it is they're building? How do you decide is it important or not? How do you divide up their time? What should you be focusing on? So this entire talk is hopefully to guide you in terms of your thought process and then end off with a couple of patterns to help you build and iterate very quickly that we've seen be very successful. So first off, let's start off defining about what an MVP is. Now, a lot of people understand that MVP stands for minimum viable product. But they don't necessarily understand that, because telling someone that might not necessarily mean that they understand that. I just quickly want to double check. I do see there are, I think, some questions popping up. What I'm going to suggest is that we will have a Q&A section at the end. Alternatively, if there's something specific that you feel during the session you quickly want to clarify, just unmute, ask me the question, we can have a chat, and then we can continue with the presentation. So getting back to the MVP, that minimum part or minimal part is what actually gets people that they don't fully understand. So basically, this quote sums it up nicely, which is if you aren't embarrassed by your first version of your product, you ship too late. What do we mean by this? Well, let me show you what Amazon looked like when it launched. And it was an absolute beauty. As you can see, this is the pinnacle of the mid-90s websites. It's, it's got text, it's got blue hyperlink highlighting. But the point here is that this site, while not that pretty, was functional. It allowed you to do what this idea was that Jeff Bezos had, which is buy books online. Because remember, as a startup, you have an idea. It is an idea, it's a hypothesis, it is not yet fact. You think you know there's something in the market that needs to be addressed and you are able to address it and you've got the solution to that problem. But until people start using your product and actually validate that, it's just an idea. So the whole focus for today is how do we go from I've got an idea to getting the feedback to making sure that we can actually get this in front of customers and make sure that this is what we should be delivering. So let's look at the MVP's value proposition statement. There are a couple of components to this. The first one is that it needs to be viable and usable. So it literally has to do something. It doesn't help you ship a app or a service where they can log in, it looks wonderful, but it does absolutely nothing. That doesn't help you. When they actually use the app, if you're going into markets where the applications or the current solutions available are not good and people do not love using them, that's normally a sign of a market that you can possibly tap by making your product lovable. What do we mean by this? I'm sure if you think about, there are some services that you use almost daily or you have to use, for example, that you don't love using. Interacting with those people or those specific services is not fun. It's like slow call centers, multiple menu options. The app has too many options. It's complicated. All you want to do is you want to go into the app, do one thing, get out of the app again. But you have to click through 17 menus. So think about those industries when you are building your app. You want your customers to love your product and not just go like, oh crap, I have to use this. Because remember, you're a startup. You don't have a customer base necessarily. You're trying to capture a new market. Then also you have to focus on making your app testable from your side. I'm not talking about software testing, making sure the app does that what it's supposed to, but you also want to be able to understand how your customers are using it and is this the right solution? We're going to dig into this quite a bit later, where we've seen a couple of startups start up with one idea and then actually start realizing there's a different market or different value proposition they want to focus on, and then actually pivot and decide to offer that rather. So the first part is that when you're building out this MVP that you're working on, a lot of people seem to think that if a customer comes to you with a challenge saying, I want to go from point A to point B quicker, that this is the development process where you decide, I know I want to get them a car, so let's start building the wheel, then the undercarriage, connect the wheels to the undercarriage, then start building the body of the car, ultimately add all the bells and whistles, and we end up with a car. No. So it's quite easy to fall into this trap where you think, I know what the customer wants. Let me go off, build this car for the next 6 to 12 months. And then once I emerge from my cave, I show it to the market and they go like, this is nice, but we don't have this problem. This doesn't solve anything for us. What you want to do is use iterative feedback from your customers. So start off with, I've got an unhappy customer. The customer wants to go from point A to point B quicker. What's the easiest, most bare bone solution that I can put in front of them? Your MVP, which is put some wheels on a piece of wood. You've got a skateboard, congratulations. Get it in front of the customers. They're slightly happier because guess what? They can go faster from point A to B, but they bring you the feedback saying, listen, your product has this feature, bloody elbows and knees, that we don't quite like because we keep falling and it hurts. Can you make it better? You take that feedback, say, okay, cool, well, let's add a brake and let's add some handlebars to make it easier to steer and also stop so we don't have this, bloody elbow feature. Then they're still not happy, but they a little bit less. They see that, okay, this is starting to solve the problem for them. Then it goes like, okay, there are hills. How do I get up the hill faster? I don't, it's not fun carrying the skateboard because what's the point then? Then you go, okay, cool. Let's go add some gears to it. You end up with a bicycle. Right now, the customer's starting to get happy because guess what? It's starting to solve more and more of the problem spaces they're dealing with. And then ultimately they come, or the second last, they come back to say, listen, this hill thing is working great, except I live in Cape Town and there's a thing called wind in the summer. Can you please help us fix that? Because that'll make the product that much better. You listen to the feedback, you add a motor to it and you end up with a motorcycle. Great. Customers are now really starting to become happy. The last bit of feedback is they say, well, Cape Town also has this weird feature where there's rain. Is there anything you can do to help us with that? And that's how you end up with a car that is allows the person to be encased with some kind of motor to take them from point A and B. And that's when they get super happy. And that's how you end up with your product. So how do we get to that? Well, let's take a look at a couple of sections for this. The first part, what we'll look at today, is the development process in terms of how you should think about allocating time to your developers, how you should think about features, breaking them down, etc. Then we're going to quickly touch on some anti-patterns because there are some warning signs of things that you shouldn't be spending time on. And sometimes you fall into the trap of thinking these are important, but let's highlight them and make sure that you understand things to avoid. Then I'll jump over into some sample architectures, and you'll see that this ties in very well to the previous slide with the building of the car bit by bit, where you make use of the different services to slowly start building up your application or service that you're offering to your customers. And then what we'll see is that you can keep expanding, adding additional functionality as you need it. You don't pre-build it, you build it as you start needing it. And then lastly, we're going to wrap up with some core foundations around things that you need to know and put extra emphasis on when you start building your app. It's not something that you can just easily, slap on afterwards and say, yeah, no, we've got that now. We are sorted. So development process. Firstly, a popular methodology they might have heard of is in the Agile space is Scrum or Kanban or any one of these mechanisms where you try and build something and get it out in front of your customers quickly. Because remember, every time you build a feature, you want to spend the minimum amount of time from idea to putting in front of the customer. Because remember, everything is a hypothesis. You need to validate this by getting the customer feedback. So what you want to do is you want to set up these small iterations where you get to build a new feature and you get it out in front of your customer and then also measure the impact that it has. And then when you get down to this point, you're able to get that feedback and adjust to it. Now, when you think about Scrum specifically, we use things called sprints. Now, a sprint is we decide on a time frame, but typically we see anything between 1 week and a 6-week sprint. And during that sprint, you will have a number of tasks that you want to complete. And at the end of the sprint, you should be able to deploy what you have to get customer feedback and also show that things are working the way expected. So when we start thinking about exactly what is inside that sprint, the time frame depends entirely on you, but I would recommend 2 weeks seems to be a good number, because if you take 6 weeks, remember it takes 6 weeks to get feedback. You don't want to spend 6 weeks building something, put it in front of customers, and they go like, this doesn't solve our problem. So shorter is better, but once again, find that optimal spot in terms of what works for you. Now, during this process, while you're building out what you've decided to build in the sprint, there are a couple of guidelines. The first one is that you want to complete what you're busy building, so you need to give your developers uninterrupted time to actually focus on it. And what do we mean by this is that, let's say you're 2 weeks into your 3-week sprint. You just realize that you, as the founder or CEO of this startup, have solved a specific new challenge. You know this is going to push the product forward. This will make everything better. The best thing you can do is, same as with a naughty kid, go stand in a corner, keep quiet, and wait for the sprint to finish. The reason for this is that you don't want to spend time starting to build a feature, stop it halfway, start on a new feature, stop it halfway, start on a new feature, stop it halfway. Because at the end of the day, you can end up with this Frankenstein app or product where you've got a little bit over here and a little bit over there. It kind of does things, it doesn't really do things. Because remember, when you're building software, it's not like you can take a feature and say, listen, I want these 3 features, let's quickly put them together and just release at the end of the week. We can come back to the other feature in a couple of weeks. It's not like building something physical where if they're separate buildings, they can be different. But just remember, this is not how software works. So please focus on that, because that's the biggest thing that we see people derail. We've already touched a little bit on keeping your sprint short. So the next question that typically comes up is, okay, so we know we need to put features and things inside a sprint. We know we need to complete them. What do we actually focus on our sprint? And this is where you need to do a bit of upfront planning. Now, when you're doing your planning in terms of to figure out what it is that you're building, is that there's this very good 2x2 grid that you can use to assess what features and things you want to build next. And what you do is you take a look at what's the impact. Is it high or low? And is it quick or slow to build? And when you do that, you get 4 quadrants. Now, the first quadrant, bottom right, is a distraction, which is something that's fast to build, but it doesn't really have an impact. It's busy work. It makes me feel good. You know what? I took our square buttons and I made them round. It took me a week, but that's quick. Look how these round buttons go. You go like, okay, so round button is great, but what does it actually do for the customer? It's like, oh, no, it's a round button. It's like, no, that does not help your customer. It doesn't push the product forward. So yes, it was quick, but it didn't do anything. So it's a distraction. The things that you want to focus on is the focus area, which are high impact, fast to build features. These are the things that really change how the product works or solves the customer need or something that actually adds a lot of value. As part of this process, what will probably happen is that you'll start off with a big feature that is slow to build, but does have a high impact. It needs to do this, and this. And as a whole, once you have these 3 or 4 steps together, then there's going to be a big impact. Now, what you want to do with those features is you want to take them and you want to actually break them down into smaller chunks. And we'll take a look at this in the next slide. And then the very last type are the worst features you can build, which is the slow to build that have no impact. This is where I go and spend 3-4 months building some kind of fancy feature in the app. And when we release it, everybody just does not click on it. They just don't use it. It's like you just wasted 3 months of time where you could have been building something else. So once again, you're going to see this theme coming through often is like break things down, get them out quicker in front of your customer to get that feedback to realize, is this what I should be doing? And now getting it out quicker in front of your customers means that you want to focus on what's the minimum task size you give the developers inside a sprint. And there are a couple of guidelines here. The first one is that you want to have a discussion and figure out exactly what it is you were trying to build, because you want to reduce the scope for ambiguity. And I personally have seen this in the past where you come to me and say, listen, go build me a house. I'm like, sure, no problem. I go away for 3 months. I come back and say, boom, here's your house. It's a single bedroom, bachelor type flat with a bathroom and the kitchen and the bedroom is all one big room because one person's going to live there. It's great. And you go, wait, hold on. We didn't want a house for one person. We actually wanted a house for a small family. So we need 2 rooms, at least one for the parents, one for the kid. We need a separate bathroom, et cetera, et cetera. Why didn't you build it? You're like, well, you told me to build a house. You didn't say what. So work to removing the ambiguity. And how you do that is by breaking down the tasks and specifically breaking them down and discussing them so that one engineer can handle them. And when you think of a sprint as a whole, have a couple of these tasks. And when you think of the duration of each individual task, see if you can get it down to breaking it into half day or full day tasks. The reason for this is that any length that you associate with a task is the minimum duration you need to be able to get feedback on it. So if you give me a task that takes 2 weeks to complete, you can only ask me and get a good indication of, am I close to completion, close to the end of the 2 weeks? Because after 1 week, I'll say, yeah, it's going great. It's going great. We're making progress. And then we get to just before 2 weeks and it'll be, okay, it's starting to slow down. It doesn't really do what it's supposed to. The reason for this is that there are going to be 4 types of problems that you face when you build things, which is you use the known and unknown matrix for this. Basically, known knowns are known problems that you know you are going to have. So those are easy to add into your planning because you know what it is you need to do and you also know how to do them. Then the next type you get is the unknown knowns. It's something that you don't know you need to do. So let's say integrate with the payment provider, but you do know how to do it. You've done it before, so it's quick. Then you've got the unknown knowns. The known unknowns. Like as part of this app that we're building, we know that we need to integrate with a cryptocurrency provider of some kind, with blockchain or something, but we don't know how to do that. Those you can time box and say, listen, this is how we handle it, and this is how much time we can spend on it. After 2 days, 3 days, a week, we will take whatever the best solution is that we know at that time and move forward, possibly coming back to fix it. And then the last one that's going to derail you the most, which comes back to the ambiguity, is the unknown unknowns, which is, I didn't know that I need to integrate with a crypto provider to do this, and I also don't know how to do it. That actually derails you the most. So that's why we want to keep back to reducing the scope and actually making reducing the ambiguity. Then also, it needs to add value to the app or service or product that you're building, because otherwise you kind of have to take a step back and say, why are we building this? And then also this allows you to do a priority list. Now, priority singular. When you think about priorities, please make a stack list where you've got priority 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can't have 5 high priority items at the same time, because what do you focus on? So now that we kind of know what the task size needs to be and what we should be focusing on, it comes like, how do we actually operationalize this? And the first step there is actually doing daily stand-ups. And what this is that it happens every single day. Everyone in the team partakes in it. Everybody gets 1 minute to talk about it, and you want to try and keep it below 15 minutes. Now, a couple of gotchas here. Firstly, this is not a status update. This is not me going, hey, look, I was busy yesterday. I worked on these 5 or 10 things. No, this is me going, what did I work on yesterday? What am I working on today? And is there anything that's blocking me? And that blocking is the important one, because what you want to do is you want to surface so that everybody understands who's blocked by what. And then you take the discussion offline after the meeting to see how do you unblock those people. Because that's how you actually move faster. Because imagine spending an hour standing talking about how to unblock one person, and it only applies to that one person, and the other 5 devs are standing there going like, I wish I had my phone so I can check my email at least, because I'm now listening to something that doesn't help me. But I need to know what everyone else is working on. So that's how you do your stand-ups and get the most value out of them. And then the next step, now we're starting to dig into a little bit more the technical side, is that you want to be able to continuously ship your releases. And you want to focus on automating this quite early in the process. And you can see some of the AWS services that will help you with that. The reason for this is that when you are releasing so often with, let's say, a 2-week cadence, you don't want to be spending too much time doing that. You want to focus on getting the code out when it's ready. So look at building some kind of deployment pipeline that looks similar to this, with the steps that you see there, where once the source is committed, a build process kicks off. You've got some kind of testing mechanism to make sure that the code at least does roughly what it's supposed to, and then automatically deploys it out into, let's say, just internal users or a subset of Canary users or whatever set you want. There are a couple of ways you can skin that cat. But just remember that you want to automate this and actually work on this quite early on, because you don't want to waste time on it. So now we've got a rough idea of how we go about thinking about tasks, how to break it down, how to start building it. Let's quickly cover some of the anti-patterns that we see. Now, we spoke about features in terms of prioritization. Now, when you look at this slide over here, what you can see is that the size of a circle indicates the impact that the feature will have. And you can see that there are a couple of big features past the end of the runway. And the end of the runway, for those not yet familiar with this, is that you are out of money. And I personally have found that developers tend not to want to work for free. So if you don't have the ability to pay your developers, they likely won't be delivering code to you and help push your product forward, similar to other people working in the company. So how do you avoid this? Well, when you think about those features that are really going to push forward and actually validate the hypothesis that you have, you want to push them to the front of the priority and get those big features out, because you want to make sure that your hypothesis is actually validated either positively or negatively. And why this is important is that, let's say if we go back to the previous slide, I've got, there we go. I've got this great idea, those 2 big bubbles at the end. I run out of money and I'm not able to actually get that in front of customers, which means I can't validate that this is a good way of doing it. And I can either go ask, do another round of funding, potentially get some more runway to go and test it, or I can start a new startup and try this again. Because remember, I still don't know if this is a solution that will work. And now I spend more money. Whereas if you did it over here, let's say you did get it in front of customers and they basically gave you the feedback saying, listen, it doesn't seem to solve anything, because that is unfortunately the reality you have to deal with, is that you building something might not be a solution to what people are looking for. That is not necessarily a bad outcome. It tells you that I need to build something else. So now you can focus on something else for the next iteration. And what this prioritization allows you to do is to go through that process, figure out, is this something the users want, and how do I pivot, how do I make it better, how do I refine what I have to get the customers happy and wanting to use the product. Then let's go on the happy path. You say you've got some customers and they start using your product. You might have developers and they might start talking to you about technical debt, saying, listen, it's hard to add features, it's hard to fix, do new things on this, because we took shortcuts, we did things with duct tape and sticky tape. Firstly, nothing wrong with that, especially in a startup. You might have some developers that come and say, oh no, this is terrible, we have to go proper 3-tier architecture, or we have to do microservices. Don't worry, we'll cover that in a little bit. But you will get up to a point where it starts becoming harder and harder to add features and change your app because of these shortcuts that you took initially. And that's fine. That's what's known as technical debt. And at some point, you have to address this technical debt. Now, the challenge there is that often developers view this as an absolute value, or the company saying, well, if we want to fix this, it's going to take X amount of time. So let's say 2 or 3 weeks worth of full-time development, or we can get a consulting company in and they'll charge us $50,000 for this. Now, holy crap. In absolute terms, $50,000 or a month worth of development, that is way too much. We can't afford that. But if you look at it in relative terms, so let's start thinking you are starting to generate some customers, you're starting to get revenue. Your revenue is around a couple of $100,000 a month, maybe even $1 million a month. You've now got 10 or 15 developers. When we look at the technical depth through that lens, and we look at it in a relative terms to how we are doing, yes, 50,000 is still a lot of money, but 50,000 relative to the million and the that we have coming in every month is not that large, and we can actually afford it at this time. Similarly, if you've got more developers that can actually focus and you can say, listen, you two go and make things better while the rest still focus on other services and push the product forward, you can now afford it. Where in absolute terms, yes, it's exactly the same amount of effort, except now it doesn't derail the startup completely. Then, next part is when you start building your system. A lot of people don't fully understand the trade-off you make when you go from a single system into multiple different subsystems or microservice architecture. So let's quickly dig into that. On an abstraction level, when I've got one system and it does everything, it's easy to understand what the abstraction is. Well, there's a piece of code, it does the following 50 things or 10 things or whatever number it is you have, and I can understand it. Whereas if I've got 10 or 15 or 30 systems, each interacting with each other in some way, understanding the system as a whole is much harder. What happens is, as you start adding systems and moving from a single system to a multiple system architecture, it becomes harder to understand the abstraction. But the trade-off you're making is by saying, I'm going from a rigid system that just does one thing or a couple of things, and it does that one thing in one way. I can go to a more flexible system. Because remember, if you think about having multiple different systems, you can take the one system, scale it. You can have the one system and let's say change just that part of it without affecting the rest of the systems in terms of the code base and how you go about building software. That's the trade-off. And also, when we get to the microservices portion, we will have a bit of discussion around more nuances around that. But the important thing you want to get over to your developers is that if they build it, they must maintain it. The reason this is super important, you might have heard of DevOps. It's become very popular the last few years. You can even have it as a title now. But it's a philosophy of bringing the developers and the operations people closer together. The reason for this is that initially, way back, you would have developers building new features, and they were responsible for building the feature and getting it ready for release. On the other side, you had operations people, which were incentivized to focus on stability and keeping the system up and running. And also, they were the people being called at 3 a.m. when something breaks. Now what happened is that you've got two opposing goals. I want to get new features out because that's what I'm focusing on. I want to keep the system the same, so don't add anything that can break it potentially. And it's my problem if it breaks, but I don't have any influence on what's being developed. Combine the two. Figure out how you can make your developers be responsible for what it is they deploy and also that they need to maintain it. Because being a developer, building a new shiny feature is awesome. You get that adrenaline rush. You get that nice serotonin kickoff feeling like you made a difference. Whereas fixing things, maintaining it, upgrading libraries, patching things, that's not a lot of fun. But you need to own it. Because when you own it, it changes the way you think about it. You're not just going to grab a new library every single time you want to use just one feature from it. You're going to take a step back and say, listen, should I use this? Because if I have to maintain this, what's the maintenance cost on this? So it actually focuses your devs to understand what the trade-offs are that they are making. And what this allows them to do is to start building less and delivering, because this is where AWS and cloud comes in, because there's no infrastructure provision and management. So when you think of serverless, for example, or cloud services, you can spin up a database with a couple of clicks within 5 minutes. There's no, let me go out and buy hardware and actually rack it somewhere, install the operating system and all that. If you go as far as, for example, using AWS or Amazon Lambda, you can actually just write the business logic for your code. You can do things like scale automatically, only pay for the services you use. And also when you start looking at the services and how they interconnect, you can see that they are highly available and secure by default. You don't have to take on that responsibility. So this is where the big value proposition of cloud comes in. And I'm sure Henry's going to talk about this in a bit, but when you look at startups in the late 90s, it would cost about $500,000 to validate an idea, and it would take quite a long time to do that because nobody had like farms of servers running around that you could use for a little bit of time. That was not a business model that was available. Whereas now that number's gone down to about $5,000 20 years later. The reason being is that I can run an experiment where I spin up a massive workload for, let's say, machine learning, run it for a couple of days or weeks and test, is my idea working or not, and then shut it down.